Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund? What is UNICEF doing to help children, especially those in the poorest countries, secure a quality education? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're taking a look at UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, and what it's doing especially to help children in some of the poorest countries of the world to receive a quality education. My guest today is an expert on this issue. My guest today is Ms. Jo Bourne. Ms. Bourne is UNICEF's Associate Director and Global Chief of Education. Ms. Bourne formerly worked in Chinese Teacher Training College as a volunteer with voluntary service overseas, and she has taught primary age children in the UK and in China. After completing an MA in Education and International Development, she joined the UK Department for International Development on education programs, and she worked in Zimbabwe, Malawi, Uganda, and Rwanda. Jo Bourne, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to get into the educational part of your package right now, or your operation, but let's talk a little bit about UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund. UNICEF is probably one of the best known UN agencies around the world, but when was it started and why was it started?
It was started in 1946 as a response to the crisis for children in post-war Europe and China, but within a few years that mandate expanded to all children globally and to women and children. Nowadays UNICEF is one of the largest providers, for example, of vaccines worldwide, but it also works under the Convention on the Rights of the Child to help children get better nutrition, water and sanitation, support if they're suffering from HIV/AIDS, and prevention, of course, and critically quality education.
Now, you're involved in the basic education program. You're heading that up. And how does your office, how do you develop your educational priorities? How do you decide where to focus your resources, your attention, your person power, the ability to affect people's lives and to make a change and to provide that quality education?
Yeah, so we work in about 190 different countries, that's UNICEF globally, and most of those countries are signatories to the Convention of the Rights of the Child, and education is very firmly in there. So that's the kind of high-level mandate that we have. But there's also the Millennium Development Goals, and universal primary education is goal number 2, which again is about all children having an opportunity to complete good quality primary education. So that's how our priorities are set. But we work at a country-by-country level, context by context, enabling children who are not in school to go to school, and also supporting education systems to have a better quality education.
Now, do we have an idea of how many children there are who are not being educated? I know there are many reasons that children aren't being educated, perhaps because of poverty, they have to work, or perhaps they're in a war zone, like in Syria or something like that. But do we have an idea of how many are unable to go to school?
So globally there are an estimated 57 million primary age school children who are not in school. And like you say, over 50% of them are probably in conflict affected areas. Slightly more of them are girls. And poverty, location, if you're rural or urban, all make a huge difference if you come from an ethnic minority. If you speak the wrong language in a country, all of those things stop children from being able to go to school. And then at the lower secondary age, which is the basic education bit, there's probably another 71 million children who aren't managing to get to lower secondary as well. So the numbers are huge.
They certainly are. Now, if our viewers would like more information on this, they can go to www.unicef.org and tap into what we're talking about and learn a lot more about UNICEF. When you're talking about childhood education, that's a broad concept, but what are some of the components that go into identifying how you provide quality education to children?
Okay, so there's quality education. I mean, I talked about 57 million children not being in school. But the kind of second biggest crisis at the moment is that there are 250 million children who reach about the age of grade 4, that's about 7-8 years old, and are not able to read or write. And over half of those children are actually children who are going into school. So what we know with the schools that children are going to is that we have a learning crisis, that children aren't learning as well as they should be. There's no magic bullet for solving learning. If we knew what the magic bullet was, I think we'd all be a lot happier. But there are things that we can do that can help. So, for example, helping countries to focus on teaching children to read is one of the most important things we can do. It's complicated. There are many, many languages children need to learn to read in their mother tongues. Making sure we have the right teachers in classrooms, supporting them to do a good job, training them well, and assuring that they are able to turn up and that they're focusing their time and attention on teaching children and not on other things. So there's a number of different things that we can do to actually help children learn and to hold ourselves accountable for that.
Exactly. And you mentioned that Millennium Development Goal number 2, there were 8 Millennium Development Goals adopted by the UN in 2000. And of course, number 2 was to provide universal primary school education, because it is so critical that children be educated. That is the pathway to a better life, to a higher quality of life. As you look at some of the strategies, is there one that's, I know they all come together, every country is the same, but every country is different probably. Is there one that's more effective as far as the critical element to make sure that children receive a primary school education? Is there one that kind of rises to the top of those?
Okay, one thing I will say before I answer that is that whilst we talk about education being a right, you're absolutely right. It's also a critical investment in the future. It's an investment in the stability of the communities and the countries. It's an investment in economic growth. It's an investment in future earnings. And critically, it's also an investment in health of children. So we figure that if women had received secondary education in sub-Saharan Africa, we could have saved something like 1.8 million lives in terms of young children dying. So, what is it that works? Well, quite often it's very country specific, but one of the things that UNICEF is working on doing is trying to help our partner countries identify exactly who is out of school, why are they out of school, and what are the best strategies to do that. And sometimes it's fairly simple things like scholarships for girls can help girls go to education, have education. Sometimes it's around making sure we have teachers in the right places and that they're turning up at the right day. Sometimes it's about textbooks. Sometimes it's about making classrooms accessible to children with disabilities.
Now, a moment ago I said the website, www.unicef.org, and unfortunately we put the wrong one up there. It's UNICEF. They put up unicef.com, but we go live to tape. We don't edit this program, but we want to make sure it's right, because I know many of our viewers will want to tap into unicef.org, because it has just a wealth of information. And again, as I mentioned, they'll learn much more about what we're talking about today. As far as the education, well, the systems around the world are different, obviously, in different countries, based upon their cultures, based upon the financial abilities of the governments or the private sector, whatever the case might be. But the goal of Millennium Development Goal number 2 was to guarantee universal primary school education. And you talked about some very large numbers of children who are not being educated. It looks like some of the Millennium Development Goals are going to be achieved. The one to reduce abject poverty by 50% by 2015. It looks like that's already been achieved to a large degree. This one, though, is lagging a little bit. It's not as far behind as maternal mortality rates or children mortality rates, infant mortality rates. But what can be done to maybe accelerate this, or to try to make sure that more children are educated by 2015 or shortly after that, as we go into the post-2015 Millennium Development Goals?
Okay. The one thing to remember is that in the last 13 years, there's actually been a huge amount of progress in getting children into school. Over 50 million more children in school, and if you consider the population is always rising, the fact that those numbers have continued to go up and more children than ever are able to reach school means that we do know some of the right strategies about removing barriers, building schools closer to children, a whole range of different strategies that have worked. But going forward, there are 2 key things we need to focus on, and I can't emphasize this enough. In a way, the last 13 years, we've reached the children that were easier to reach. Going forward, we need to focus on those children who are furthest from that goal. So let me give you a country example.
Sure.
In Nigeria, the average number of years of schooling that a child gets is between 6 and 7 years. Now, that's not enough as an average. But if you start to break those statistics down, if you are a rural girl from the Hausa tribe, you will have 0.2 years of education. Whereas if you are a richer boy in one of the more urban areas, you'll be getting 14, 15 years of education of a reasonable quality. So the inequities within countries are critical, and going forward we need to focus on those children who are left behind, but not just those children getting into school. That's not enough. We have to also enable them to get into school and learn.
Exactly, that's very true. Not just be at a desk with
Exactly.
a roof over their heads and walls and that type of thing, but it's very critical that they do that. And you say now that, and you gave an example of children, you reach some of the more easily reachable students at the first part, but now it's going to become more difficult to get to some of the others. And I'm assuming that one of the more difficult areas too would be, now you mentioned the country is not at war, but if you're in a war zone, for example, in Syria, or perhaps in some other area that there's havoc, that people are killing each other, children can't go to school. In many cases, I think a lot of the children in Syria, some of the refugees, the children are working to actually maintain the families. But that seems like it'd be a very difficult situation. How will you deal with that, and how will you overcome that problem?
Well, it's one of the areas UNICEF really does some pretty astounding work in. But I mean, if we look at the Syria example and say take Lebanon, which is the country that is got the largest number of Syrian refugees at the moment, the numbers are absolutely staggering. We estimate right at the moment there are something like 300,000 Syrian refugee children out of school, but over the next 2 years those numbers could rise to as large as 750,000 to over 1 million in the next 2 years if the numbers of people coming into Lebanon still continue. So what do you do in a situation like that? So we're working with the government of Lebanon on a range of different options, including the extent to which Syrian children can join Lebanese children in schools, and also strengthening non-formal education. But the numbers remain huge, and the resources are generally not enough for education in situations of conflict, particularly protracted conflicts like this one.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today we're taking a look at UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, and what it's doing to try to help provide a quality education to children in many parts of the world, especially those living in the poorest areas. And my guest today is an expert on this topic. My guest today is Ms. Jo Bourne. Ms. Bourne is UNICEF's Associate Director and the Global Chief of Education for the United Nations Children's Fund. Jo, we're talking about some really very difficult situations. And as you mentioned, UNICEF is really a frontline agency. It has thousands of workers out there in some very difficult areas of the world, and they are often in harm's way. They're sitting in an office or something like that, but they're on the front lines in many respects. This seems to me like it'd be one of the greatest challenges that you would have to reach out to people in Syria or in some other war-torn area. But another problem comes to mind is this recent horrific cyclone or typhoon that went through the Philippines, and it was just absolutely devastating. It just literally wiped out parts of the Philippines, wiped out buildings, killed latest I heard was over 5,000 people. That may have gone up. But how do you deal with that particular type of situation with a natural disaster, be it a typhoon or perhaps an earthquake or something that just debilitates the entire community, leaves very little standing as far as buildings go, a lot of the infrastructure is knocked out, a lot of professionals have been killed. How does UNICEF deal with that?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is I've always absolutely astounded just by how quickly UNICEF mobilises its staff and how ready its staff are to go to situations like this and to work the best they can. Coordination is absolutely critical, as you can imagine. We estimate in Philippines, and of course it is just an estimation, that over 1 million children have been displaced from their schools. Thousands of schools have been destroyed, and those that haven't been destroyed are being used as evacuation centres, which you can understand. And yet for children who've been through this kind of level of trauma and separated from their families, maybe reunited again, maybe with guardians, one of the things that once they have the water and the sanitation and the food needs met and the shelter needs met, they often ask for is they want to go back to school, they want to go back to some sense of normalcy, and if possible also we quite often provide counselling. So already UNICEF has sent over 350 school kits which will reach about 15,000 children, and recreational kits, frisbees and things like that, that will reach about 25,000 children, and then very large tents that can be used as temporary learning centres. So we're doing that, but we continue to do continual needs assessment, and some of my staff are en route to Manila right now to help with that, so that we can continue to make sure that the supplies that we have and the support that we have can reach the people who need it the most.
And that assessment is so critical to make sure you're getting the right services to the people who really need them and can utilize them. That brings up another issue too. How do you monitor and evaluate your programs? I'm sure you do, all the UN agencies do as far as looking at their programs, but how do you take a look at the program to see if it is effective and is reaching the targeted population?
So every program, every investment we make has to have some kind of monitoring and evaluation framework. It has indicators, it has targets, and we routinely monitor our progress against these for every single investment, every single country program that we have. In an emergency situation, we will quite often use third-party verification means, because it's certainly in a place like Syria, we may not be able to actually get into the areas to verify whether the supplies have reached those places, but we will then have contacts who can take photographs and can feed back to us that those supplies are reaching the people that need them most.
Now, if our viewers would like to contribute, they can contribute to UNICEF. Is that correct? You can
That's right.
go online, unicef.org, and make contributions to help with the remarkable work that the UNICEF workers are doing in many very difficult areas of the world. So we would encourage everyone to do that. And let me just ask you the next question. What is the biggest challenge you run into? Is it financial, or are there some other challenges that your office runs into when you're trying to implement these educational programs in the various countries?
Oh gosh, that's hard. I mean, finance is always an issue in education. As you probably know, most education provision is financed by governments. And one of the things, again, we've seen over the last few years is a great many of governments have increased the domestic financing for education, and we would certainly encourage that. But there's still not enough. I mean, just as a very, very baseline, we estimate that there needs to be an extra $26 billion a year in order to secure all children primary education. And unfortunately, the sort of external aid flows that come into education have been stagnating for a number of years. So that does remain a really big challenge. A couple of other challenges related to that. The data around education is actually quite difficult. So I talk about 57 million and 250 million not reading, but actually getting that data on a global level is not always that straightforward, and many countries are not reporting on how many children they have at school or how many children they think are out of school. And finally, if there are many, many resources flowing into the education system, both domestic and external, I think we have to work very strongly together to make sure those resources are used very well to get the types of results that we can hope for, so the children do fulfill their potential.
Now, UNICEF has quite a network around the world, but you also have a lot of partners too, do you not? Who are some of your major partners as far as in the United Nations system, but also outside of the UN system, non-governmental organizations? Who are some of the key players? I know you probably could identify 300, 400, 500,
Great
which
many.
we can't do all those.
I mean, I can talk about the main global partners, but
Sure.
obviously there are partners at every level in every country. Our primary partners, of course, are governments. Because they are the ones who have the mandate to fulfill the rights for children. But certainly in the education field, we work closely with UNESCO, with the Secretary General's Global Education First initiative, with the Global Partnership for Education. So those are the big sort of global and UN pieces, the World Bank, of course. And then we work closely with agencies like Save the Children, who we co-lead the emergency clusters with. So those are the kind of some of the big partners, but that's by no means all of them, and I'll probably be in trouble for having missed a few off.
That's always the danger when I
Yeah.
ask people to identify their main partners, because so often they have many of them, and that's very important. Now, you mentioned one of the initiatives, Secretary General's initiative. There's one too, the UN Girls Initiative.
Yeah.
What exactly is that?
The UN Girls Education Initiative, yeah.
Yes.
It was set up about 10 years ago, and it's very focused on obviously the rights of girls to go to have an education. And I've talked a little bit about the reasons why this is so important. Somebody said to me the other day, if there was one silver bullet when it comes to development, it's educating girls, and it's educating girls through to secondary school. Because of the benefits that accrue to girls and their families, which are intergenerational. So, you know, those women are less likely to die in childbirth, their children will be healthier, they're more likely to seek medicine and medical care for their children, so we'll have fewer deaths. So, you know, it goes on and on and on. They are more likely to earn themselves, they are more likely to withstand domestic violence if they are better educated. So it really is something that's hugely important. Coming to UNGAI, the UN Girls Education Initiative. This is a partnership, it's a global partnership that brings together the advocacy voices of many, many, many NGOs, civil society organisations, UN partners to advocate for the rights of girls in pretty much all the countries across the globe where there is still a problem with girls' education.
Do you find that the consciousness level of the people who are involved in this, I know UNICEF obviously, and the UN system, you've promoted, to empower women also is Millennium Development Goal number 3, which ties right into this.
Absolutely.
But do you find that the consciousness level is raising? Because there's a lot of opposition in some countries not to have girls go to school. They just don't see the utility in doing that to some degree. But do you find that perhaps that those attitudes are changing to a large degree, and that women are girls and boys, women and men are viewed as equals, equal human beings? Or does it varies from region to region and country to country?
Does, yeah. I mean, I think it's in some ways it's becoming a little bit more polarized, and in some places, and I think, you know, the example of Malala from Pakistan and her courage in speaking out for the rights of all children to have an education, and particularly for girls, really does demonstrate that there's a great deal of push to enable to support children to have an education. But there are still other countries in the world where perhaps it's becoming more politicized and more difficult. So northern Nigeria, there are a number of attacks on schools and against education, and particularly around education for girls. So it is very difficult. It is good that it's being talked about. I'm very hopeful that education will have its own goal in the post-2015 agenda, because it's still one of the most important investments we can make in the future prosperity of our world and our communities.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point too, because a lot of, well, not a lot of people, some people I guess thought maybe the UN would have, or the world, the UN helped create it, the member states of the United Nations developed the Millennium Development Goals, but a lot of non-governmental organizations, faith-based groups, you have labor unions, you have private business people who are involved in helping to achieve those 8 Millennium Development Goals to have abject poverty by 50%, to promote universal primary school education, empower women, to promote sustainable development, and the other goals. But once we hit 2015, those goals are not going to die. They're going to continue. And how you mentioned education just briefly. What would you like to see education do or be involved in that post-2015 sustainable development concept?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, first of all, I'd like to see a single compelling education goal that is broader than the current focus on primary education. So we're probably looking at something which will give us indicators around early childhood, around learning, because that is most definitely one of the biggest crises we're facing, but also recognition that, of course, education doesn't stop at primary. It goes on to lower secondary, and also quite often involves the different types of skills training as well. So how we manage to formulate that is still very much a case in point, and having better data and ways of measuring those things will be an important part of shaping that final goal, but we're working on it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's what has to be done, because you can't stop and say, well, we've achieved some of the goals, but we're going to let the rest of them just sort of fall to the wayside. We've got to continue to build on the ones, and there have been a lot of gains made. And a lot of people believe that had the United Nations not developed these 8 Millennium Development Goals, that the gains that were made in education, or the gains in reducing abject poverty, or the gains on those other development goals would never have been achieved, because it was more of a shotgun approach, a sporadic approach to dealing with these problems. But the UN focused the lens. It really focused, put the limelight right on 8 areas that everybody could identify with and work towards, and it seems to have galvanized the world, and it's very important that we work on these and try to achieve them and to carry them over into 2015. But Joe Bourne, I want to thank you for bringing us up to date on what the education operation within the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, is doing, and we would encourage all of our viewers to go to www.unicef.org and get much more information about what we've been talking about today, as well as the other programs that you deal with, not you personally, but the other parts of UNICEF, maternal and child health care programs and others. But Joe Bourne, thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program. Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.